The winter of 1943 was perhaps the darkest chapter in Luftwaffe history, though few realized it at the time. German fighter pilots, the Experten as they were called, had dominated European skies for years. They had defeated the Polish Air Force, the Dutch, the Belgians, and the French. They had fought the RAF to a standstill during the Battle of Britain. They had carved through Soviet defenses in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. These were not ordinary pilots. These were warriors who had accumulated dozens, sometimes hundreds of kills. They were confident, experienced, and utterly convinced of their superiority. Yet by December 1943, something had changed. Something that would transform the entire air war over Europe and ultimately determine the outcome of World War II itself. That something was a fighter aircraft that the Germans had underestimated, dismissed, and failed to recognize as a fundamental threat until it was far too late. The story of the P-51 Mustang begins not with American ambition, but with British desperation. In 1940, the Royal Air Force faced a crisis that threatened to cripple their entire bombing offensive. German Bf-109 fighters, piloted by experienced aces, were systematically destroying British bombers at unsustainable rates. The RAF needed a long-range escort fighter, a machine that could fly all the way to targets deep inside Germany and back. They asked North American Aviation, an American manufacturer, to build one. The result was the P-51 Mustang. When it first entered service in 1941, it was disappointing. The original engine, an Allison V1710, lacked the power needed for high-altitude performance. The aircraft could fly, certainly, but it could not dominate. It was relegated to low-level work, fighter bombing missions, ground attack. It was not a premier fighter. Many American pilots didn't even want to fly it. But then in 1942, someone posed a simple question. What if the Mustang's fuselage, which was aerodynamically superior to anything the British had, was mated with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire? What if you took the best American design and combined it with the best British engine? The results of that experiment were extraordinary. The Mustang with a Merlin engine could fly higher, faster, and farther than any fighter in the world. It combined the Spitfire's power with aerodynamic efficiency that the Spitfire lacked. It was, in many respects, the perfect marriage of tenacious engineering expertise. The first Merlin-powered P-51s began arriving in England in late 1943. They were initially used in small numbers, supplementing the P-47 Thunderbolts that had been the primary escort fighter. But the Americans quickly realized what they had. Here was a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin. Here was a fighter that could stay over a target area for extended periods. Here was a fighter that, for the first time, could challenge German fighters on equal or superior terms at any altitude. The Germans, however, remained unaware of the magnitude of the threat. Intelligence reports arrived at Luftwaffe headquarters describing a new American fighter. The reports were vague, often contradictory. Some said it was fast. Others said it was maneuverable. Nobody seemed quite certain what they were dealing with. The Luftwaffe High Command made a strategic decision. They would continue with their current fighter force, the Bf-109 and the FW-190. They would not develop new aircraft. After all, they had been winning the air war for years. What could the Americans possibly have that would change that? It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The first major engagement between P-51s and German fighters occurred in the fall of 1943. The results shocked the German High Command. American pilots, many of them younger and less experienced than their German counterparts, were shooting down German fighters at a rate that defied German calculations. How was this possible? The German pilots had more experience. Many had flown hundreds of combat missions, yet they were losing. The answer lay in a combination of factors. The P-51 was faster in level flight than the Bf-109, and comparable to the FW-190. It could climb faster than either German fighter. It had superior visibility, particularly to the rear. The Bf-109, with its cramped cockpit and limited rear visibility, was at a severe disadvantage. A German pilot could be caught unaware by a Mustang approaching from behind, something that became increasingly common as American pilots learned the aircraft's capabilities. But more importantly, The P-51 changed the strategic balance of the air war. For the first time, American bombers could fight their way to Germany without fear. The escort fighters no longer had to turn back halfway. They could stay with the bombers the entire way. This meant that German fighters, instead of being able to attack a relatively undefended bomber stream, now had to contend with fighters at every stage of the mission. Over the target. On the way out, the entire journey was covered. German pilots began to report their experiences. The reports were initially dismissed as exaggeration. Surely American fighters couldn't be that good. Surely German pilots couldn't be overestimating the enemy. But the reports continued to come in. German aces, pilots with 50 kills, 100 kills, were being shot down. German pilots were being killed at rates that German industry could not replace. Pilot training, which had always been lengthy and comprehensive, was being curtailed because there was no fuel for training flights. New pilots were reaching combat units with only a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had received. By the spring of 1944, the situation had become dire. German fighter pilots were being rationed to only a few missions per month. The fuel shortage was so severe that operational aircraft sat on the ground, unable to fly. German aircraft production, impressive though it was, could not keep up with the losses being inflicted by American fighters. And the P-51 Mustang was the primary reason. What made the situation particularly galling to the German command was that the P-51 represented a combination of foreign technology. The airframe was American. The engine was British. The tactical doctrine was American. It was not a purely German design, yet it was beating purely German designs. This was particularly humiliating to a regime that had prided itself on technological superiority and racial superiority. German engineers proposed solutions. They designed new fighters. The Tu-152, with longer range and higher performance. The Me-262, a jet fighter that could fly faster than anything the Allies had. But these aircraft arrived too late and into few numbers. By the time they appeared, the air war was already lost. The Luftwaffe was no longer capable of challenging American air superiority. German pilots were flying not to win air battles, but to survive them. One German pilot, interviewed after the war, was asked what he thought had changed. He paused for a long moment before answering. "We believed we were superior," he said. "We believed our aircraft were superior. We believed our pilots were superior. We believed that American industrial capacity could produce quantity, but not quality. We were wrong about all of it." The P-51 was superior, not only in performance, but in design philosophy. It was built to be flown by young, relatively inexperienced pilots, and it worked perfectly for that purpose. The Bf-109 was built to be flown by a highly trained elite. We no longer had that elite. And when young pilots flew our aircraft against young pilots flying P-51s, we lost. By 1945, the air war in Europe was over. The Luftwaffe had been systematically destroyed. German fighters that had once seemed invincible were now rare sights in the sky. When they did appear, American fighters dealt with them routinely. The Mustang had become so dominant that German pilots often refused to engage unless they had overwhelming numerical superiority. The victory of the P-51 Mustang over German air superiority had profound consequences. Once the Allies had secure air superiority, the entire war changed. German troops couldn't move. German cities couldn't be defended. German supply lines were constantly disrupted. The strategic bombing campaign, which had been bleeding the Allies of resources and had seemed at times to be unwinnable, suddenly became viable and effective. Entire German industrial complexes were destroyed. German oil production was crippled. German cities were reduced to rubble. None of this would have been possible without air superiority. And none of this would have been possible without the P-51 Mustang. The Germans had feared many weapons during World War II. They had feared the heavy armor of Soviet tanks. They had feared the firepower of American industrial production. They had feared the determination of Soviet soldiers. But what they truly feared, what haunted their pilots and their commanders, was the P-51 Mustang, a fighter that represented not German superiority, but American innovation. A fighter that proved that sometimes willingness to learn and adapt was more powerful than pride and arrogance. In the end, The P-51 Mustang was more than a fighter aircraft. It was a symbol of American capability, American determination, and American refusal to accept defeat. It was a symbol of what was possible when brilliant minds from different nations collaborated toward a common goal. And it was a symbol of what happened when arrogance met reality on the battlefields of Europe. The German pilots who survived the war and lived into the modern era have spoken about their experiences. Many have expressed grudging respect for the P-51 and for the American pilots who flew it. They acknowledge that the Mustang was a superior aircraft. They acknowledge that the American pilots, despite their relative inexperience, proved to be formidable opponents. And they acknowledge that had the Luftwaffe recognized the threat early enough and responded appropriately, the outcome might have been different. But they didn't recognize it, and they didn't respond. And by the time they realized what they were facing, it was too late. The P-51 Mustang had already changed the course of the air war. And in changing the air war, it had changed the course of World War II itself. It had ensured that Germany would lose. It had ensured that the 1,000-year Reich would fall. It had ensured that on May 8, 1945, Germany would surrender unconditionally, all because of a fighter aircraft that the Germans had dismissed, underestimated, and failed to take seriously until it was far too late.